The morning my granddaughter called me Grampie Possum across the breakfast table, I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time. She hadn't used that name since she was 7 years old. Back then, she'd picked it up after I read her a picture book about a possum who lived in a gum tree and scared away foxes. She thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. For about a year, that was all she called me. Grampie Possum. She'd shout it from the back seat of the car, whisper it when I tucked her in, write it in crayon on cards she drew me for my birthday. Then she turned 8, started primary school properly, and decided she was too grown up for it. Became grandpa after that, which was fine, which was what grandfathers are called. But she was 26 now, and she was sitting across from me at my kitchen table in Ballarat with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her boyfriend of 4 months seated beside her, and she had just looked straight at me and said Grampie Possum like no time had passed at all. I kept my face still. I poured myself more tea. I asked her boyfriend if he took milk. His name was Rowan Steed. He was 31, well-dressed without being showy about it, and he had a way of tilting his head when you spoke to him that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. My granddaughter had met him at a networking event in Melbourne. He worked in private wealth management, he said. Boutique firm. Clients were mostly high-net-worth individuals looking for alternatives to the traditional market. I nodded when he said this. I asked what kind of alternatives. He smiled. The kind that don't show up in a standard portfolio, he said. Infrastructure. Green energy. A few things he couldn't discuss publicly, but that had delivered consistent returns for 3 years running. My granddaughter was looking at her mug when he said this. I noticed that too. Let me tell you about my granddaughter. She is not naive. She never has been. She grew up in a single-parent household after her parents separated when she was 11. And she watched her mother, my daughter, work 2 jobs for 4 years to keep the mortgage on their place in Geelong. She went to university on a scholarship, finished her nursing degree, works at a hospital outside Melbourne now. She saves carefully, spends carefully, and has never once in her life struck me as someone who would be dazzled by talk of high returns and exclusive opportunities, which is why, when she called me Grampie Possum, I understood instantly that something was wrong. She knew I would notice. She had calculated that I would notice, and that Rowan Steed would not. She had chosen the most specific, most personal signal she had available, the one buried deepest in the shared history between us, and she had dropped it into the middle of an ordinary Sunday breakfast, like a stone into still water. I watched the ripples and I kept my face perfectly calm. Rowan Steed stayed for about 2 hours that morning. He was charming throughout. He asked about my years working for the local council, seemed genuinely interested in infrastructure funding models, which in hindsight I understand was not coincidental. He helped clear the plates. He offered to fix a loose hinge on the back door before my granddaughter told him they needed to get going. When I walked them out to his car, a late model Volvo, dark gray, clean, he shook my hand and told me it was a real pleasure. Solid grip. Direct eye contact. The kind of man who had practiced being trustworthy so thoroughly it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. My granddaughter hugged me. She held on a few seconds longer than usual. She said she'd call me tonight. I waved them off and went back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a while, thinking. She rang at 8:30 that evening. He was dropping something off at a colleague's place, she said. She had maybe 15 minutes. I asked her straight. I said, "How long has something felt wrong?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "About 3 weeks." I asked her what had changed 3 weeks ago. She said he'd started talking about a specific investment, a property trust. He'd been mentioning it casually for the first month they were together. Nothing pushy, just references here and there. Then about a month ago it became more concrete. There were documents, a prospectus of sorts. Returns of 14 to 17% annually, secured against commercial real estate assets across Southeast Asia. She said the documents looked professional. Logo, legal language, the works. I asked her the name of the trust. She said, Harmon Pacific Capital. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope. I asked if she'd looked it up. She said she had. There was a website. It looked legitimate. An office address in Sydney, one in Singapore. Testimonials from investors. A team page with photographs and credentials. I asked if she'd tried to verify any of the people on the team page. She paused. She said she'd tried to find one of them on LinkedIn, and the profile existed but only had about 40 connections and had been created 8 months ago. I told her that was important. I told her to keep that detail. She said, I know, Grandpa. I know what it looks like. That's why She stopped. That's why I needed you to know without him knowing I'd told you. I understood. He was with her in the car that morning. She couldn't say anything directly. She couldn't show concern or suspicion without risking a reaction she wasn't prepared to manage in front of me. So she'd reached back 20 years and pulled out the one thing that only the two of us shared. The one signal that would land cleanly and invisibly. I asked her if he had asked her to invest. She said not directly. Not yet. But 2 days earlier he had mentioned that a placement window was opening. That a few of his existing clients were increasing their positions and there might be room for 1 or 2 new participants if they moved quickly. He'd mentioned a minimum entry of $20,000. I asked if she'd told him she had that kind of money available. She went quiet again. Then she said, I might have mentioned my savings early on. When we were talking about goals, I didn't think much of it at the time. I told her that wasn't her fault. I told her it was not her fault. She said she knew that in her head. Her voice said something more complicated. I asked if she'd been sent anything in writing about this placement window. She said yes. An email. She forwarded it to me while we were still on the phone. I opened it on my laptop. It was formatted well. The Harmon Pacific Capital letterhead, the same as the prospectus. It outlined the opportunity in careful, measured language. It mentioned due diligence. It mentioned that the fund was registered with ASIC. Then near the bottom, in smaller text, it said that placement confirmations needed to be received within 7 business days of the offer date. And the offer date was listed as the Saturday 4 days prior, which meant the window closed in 3 days. I told her to look at the bottom of the email again and tell me what she saw. She read it. She said, 3 days. I said, exactly. What does that tell you? She said, they don't want me to think too long. I said, they never do. We talked for another 10 minutes before she heard his car in the driveway. She said she had to go. I told her not to respond to the email. Not yet. I told her to tell him, if he brought it up, that she was still reviewing it and wanted to speak to her accountant. I told her that was a perfectly reasonable thing for any sensible adult to say about a $20,000 decision. She said, I don't have an accountant. I said, he doesn't know that. After we hung up, I sat with the email open and the envelope with Harmon Pacific Capital written on it in front of me. My wife had gone to bed early. The house was quiet. I could hear the sprinkler on the next-door neighbor's lawn clicking through its cycle. I started with the ASIC register. ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, maintains a public database of registered financial services licensees. If a fund is operating legally in this country and inviting retail investors to participate, it must hold an Australian financial services license or be operating under one. I searched for Harmon Pacific Capital. Nothing. I searched variations. Harmon Pacific, Harmon Capital, Pacific Capital Trust. Nothing that matched. I searched the ABN lookup database next. which records all registered Australian business entities. A company name that specific, with that kind of professional presence, should appear. I found an ABN registered to a Harmon Pacific TY Limited, registered 14 months ago in New South Wales. The listed director was a man named Elliot Harmon. The registered business address was a serviced office suite in North Sydney. I wrote all of this down. I looked up the address on a map. It was a co-working space, the kind that provides a professional mailing address and a bookable meeting room for businesses that don't have physical offices, which is not inherently suspicious. Plenty of legitimate small businesses operate this way, but combined with everything else, it was a piece of a picture. I then looked up the regulatory registers for Singapore, since the prospectus mentioned operations there. The Monetary Authority of Singapore maintains a similar database. I searched for Harmon Pacific Capital and its variations. Again, nothing. By this point, it was nearly midnight. I made myself a cup of Milo, old habit, something my father used to do when he was working through a problem, and I kept going. I went back to the website my granddaughter had mentioned. It was well constructed, not the kind of thing someone put together in an afternoon. There were market commentary articles, a section on ESG investment principles, and a resources page with downloadable guides on alternative asset classes. The team page had 6 people listed, photographs, titles, brief bios mentioning credentials and years of experience. I took the photographs one by one and ran them through a reverse image search. This is something most people don't think to do. You right-click the image, select the option to search for it, and the search engine will tell you if that image appears elsewhere on the internet. The photograph listed as belonging to the Chief Investment Officer, a man named Dr. Gerald Ashworth, appeared on a stock photo library website. He was listed there as model #7741. His photograph had been licensed 38 times. The photograph of the head of client relations, a woman named Sandra Foh, appeared in an article from 2019 on a Malaysian business news website. The article named her as an employee of a logistics company in Kuala Lumpur. She had nothing to do with investment management. I sat back in my chair. Everything has a smell to it once you know what you're looking for. And this had a very particular smell. It was the smell of something constructed to withstand a quick glance but not a second look. A website that worked as a backdrop. Documents that looked official without being official. Names and faces borrowed from elsewhere, assembled into a fiction of credibility. I thought about my granddaughter. I thought about the $20,000 she had saved. Carefully, over years of early shifts and overtime, and not spending money she didn't need to spend. I thought about how she had sat across from me that morning and called me Grampie Possum and trusted that I would understand. The next morning I contacted a friend of mine, a retired solicitor I'd known for 20-odd years named Bernard, who had spent part of his career in corporate law. I explained the situation. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions. Had any money been transferred? And was my granddaughter safe? I said no to the first, and yes, I believe so, to the second. He said, then, you still have room to move carefully. He told me to document everything I'd found. He told me that ASIC has a public tip-off portal where potential fraud can be reported anonymously, and that I should use it. He also said that the most important thing, before anything else, was to make sure my granddaughter did not transfer any money and did not signal to Rowan Steed that she had become suspicious until she was somewhere safe. I called her during her lunch break. I told her what I'd found. I went through it slowly. The ASIC register, the ABN, Singapore, the stock photos, Sandra Foh from Kuala Lumpur. I heard her breathing go very quiet as I spoke, the particular quiet of someone trying to hold themselves together. She said, I nearly transferred it, Grandpa. Last week. He sent me the bank details, and I nearly just did it. I had the transfer screen open. I asked what stopped her. She said she wasn't sure. Something just didn't sit right. She'd closed the screen and told him she was waiting on some paperwork to clear. She said he'd been fine about it. Patient. Which, she said, was almost more unsettling than if he'd pushed back. I told her that patience was part of the method. Pressure creates panic, and panic creates second-guessing. Patience creates trust. The longer someone sits with an idea, the more normal it starts to feel. That's what they count on. She asked me what she should do about Rowan. I told her not to make any sudden moves. I told her to tell him that her accountant had raised some questions, and she was getting a second opinion. I told her to keep a record of every communication from this point forward, every text, every email, every phone call if she could manage it, because if this escalated to a formal complaint, documentation would matter. She asked if she should be scared. I thought about that honestly before I answered. I said, I don't think you're in physical danger. These schemes depend on people not knowing they've been targeted until the money is gone. He has no reason to behave badly toward you while you're still a potential source of funds. But once you decline clearly and finally, that changes the calculation. So I want you to be somewhere comfortable and with people around you when that conversation happens. She said she understood. Over the next week, she created distance carefully. She said her financial situation had become complicated due to some unexpected costs. True enough, in its own way, and that she needed to put any investment decisions on hold. Rowan's responses shifted gradually. Still polite, but shorter. The warmth in his messages began to thin like morning frost once the sun gets high. Then one Tuesday afternoon he sent her a message saying he thought they might want different things, and that he respected her decision, but he was going to focus on people who were serious about building their futures. She sent me a screenshot. I read it twice. Then I sent her back 3 words. Save that message. She did. I submitted a tip-off to ASIC that same week. I included the company name, the ABN, the email my granddaughter had forwarded, the results of the ASIC and mass register searches, the reverse image search findings including the stock photo library reference number and the article about Sandra Foe, and a summary of what had occurred. I don't know what came of it. These things take time and there are no guarantees. But the information is on record now. And that matters. My granddaughter drove up to Ballarat the following month on a Saturday. She brought a fruitcake from a bakery she knows I like, and we sat in the back garden while my wife fussed over whether to bring out cushions for the chairs. And the afternoon light came over the fence in that particular golden way it does in late autumn here, and everything felt very ordinary and very good. At some point, she looked over at me and said, "How did you know? When I called you that name, how did you know straight away?" I said, "Because you were 7 years old when you last used it, and you were not 7 years old anymore." She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that has a little water in it. She said, "I didn't know what else to do. He was right there. I couldn't say anything. I just thought if anyone would notice, it would be you." I told her she was right about that. She said, "I keep thinking about the other women, the other people, the ones who don't have someone who notices." I didn't have a comfortable answer for that. I still don't. What I have is the knowledge that she is sitting in my garden in the autumn sunlight eating fruitcake, and that the money she saved through years of hard work is still exactly where she put it. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. There are things that come out of a situation like this that I think are worth saying plainly. Because my granddaughter was right about the people who don't have someone who notices. The first is this: a legitimate investment will never come with a deadline. Real financial opportunities do not expire at the end of the week. If someone is telling you that a window is closing and you need to act before it does, the thing they are trying to close is your thinking. Take more time, not less. A genuine fund manager will respect that. A fraudulent one will not. The second is that ASIC registration is checkable. Right now, today, anyone in Australia can go to the ASIC website and search for a financial services licensee. If a person or company is inviting you to invest money, they must hold an AFS license or operate under one. If they do not appear on that register, stop. Full stop. Don't wait for more information. Stop. The third is the reverse image search. It takes 30 seconds, and it has caught more fraudulent financial websites than I can count. If the professionals on a company's team page are using stock photos, you will know. And then you will know everything you need to know. The fourth is this. These schemes succeed by targeting people at the moment. Trust is highest. Romantic relationships are a common vehicle, not by accident. Affection creates a filter that makes critical scrutiny feel like disloyalty. If someone you are close to is asking you to invest, that is not a reason to bypass your judgment. It is a reason to use it more carefully. And the fifth, the one I think about most, is the importance of having a signal. My granddaughter had the presence of mind to create one without realizing she'd created one. Grampie Possum was a thread that ran between her childhood and my memory of it, invisible to everyone else in the room. I think all of us should have something like that. A word, a phrase, a name from long ago. Something no one outside your family would recognize. Something that means help without ever having to say help. Talk to the people you love about it. Agree on something. Keep it between you. You never know when someone at a breakfast table is going to need it.